Archana is breathing heavily as she lies naked on her bed. She has just experienced pleasure and her gaze is directed towards the ceiling fan. She turns her head to the right. Her husband Mohit is snoring loudly. After 25 years of marriage, sex had become rare, and she had long ago given up hope of enjoying it. She pulls the sheet over herself and falls asleep. It became a habit. On those rare nights when Mohit was in the mood, she would let him climb on top of her, listen to him moan for a minute, and then he would fall asleep. This is not to say that they did not love each other, they loved each other very much. But sex was boring, and both of them understood this perfectly. The next morning was chaotic and fast-paced as usual. Mohit was a government employee, and Archana didn't have a free moment until she packed his lunch and bid him goodbye. The driver, Rohan, was a punctual person, and during his tenure, he became very close to the family. He helped the family settle into their new city when they moved here a couple of years ago. After dropping Mohit off at work, he would often take Archana to the market for groceries or shopping. Both Archana and Mohit were quite open with him, and even invited him and his family for dinner once a month. Archana was an attractive woman. Although she did not exercise or practice yoga, she had a beautiful, natural figure with seductive curves. She was 168 centimeters tall, had 34 breasts, and had unusually fair skin. She was a sociable woman who enjoyed attending social events, women's clubs, and other gatherings. She always strived to be the best in everything, be it clothes, decor, or anything else. She loved the elite company of women and was still learning about their lifestyle. She grew up in a conservative family, but over time her views broadened significantly, although there were things that she was still skeptical about. For example, she never tried alcohol at these parties, despite the persuasion of her friends. But sex was what sparked her imagination. As she listened to how openly the women in this circle discussed their sex lives, she was both amazed and saddened. She increasingly began to satisfy herself, discovering new facets of pleasure that she had never even imagined before. She even started buying Western clothes and underwear. True, mainly for myself, since it had almost no effect on my husband. On another trip to the market with Rohan, she bought several new dresses. Rohan was in a talkative mood and asked, "Madam, are these Western clothes better than what women usually wear?" Archana smiled. You can say that. But there are many different types, and not all of them are convenient. Madam, it's my wedding anniversary next month, and I would like to give something to my wife. I was thinking about such clothes because she only has traditional dresses. Wow, that's so sweet, Rohan. She will definitely like it. But I don't understand anything about this. I don't even know where to start. Oh, don't worry. I will help you, Rohan. They returned home and Archana decided that they would go to the market the next day. That evening, when Mohit returned, they had dinner and soon went to bed. Archana turned to Mohit and told him about her plans for tomorrow. "So, what dresses are you going to choose with Rohan?" Mohit asked with a smile, his hand resting on Archana's thigh. "I don't know. I haven't thought about it yet. I'll decide on the spot." "Do you think Rohan will choose revealing dresses?" Archana smiled. It was obvious that Mohit was turned on by the thought, but she couldn't understand what exactly turned him on. "I don't know," Archana answered. A sudden rush of passion overwhelmed Mohit, and he reached out to Archana, kissing her with unexpected energy. She was surprised to realize how close and intense their intimacy had become at that moment. Everything happened quickly, but there was more fire and sincerity in their touches than usual. When they finally pulled away, Mohit was breathing heavily and looking unusually relaxed. "Wow, where did that come from?" Archana asked with a smile. "I don't know," he muttered, still trying to catch his breath. A few minutes later, Mohit fell asleep, and Archana, lost in her thoughts, allowed herself to briefly enjoy this pleasant feeling of closeness before also closing her eyes. The next morning was normal, and they had no opportunity to discuss what had happened during the night. Mohit went to work, and Rohan confirmed plans to go to the market. Archana agreed and started doing household chores. Rohan returned after a couple of hours. Archana wore a white kurta and leggings. Her milky white skin matched her white outfit perfectly. She got into the back seat, and they went to the market. The market wasn't too busy, and Rohan had no trouble finding parking. They entered the store, and Archana gave the necessary instructions to the saleswoman. She chose some pretty simple dresses, a long dress, a few casual tops and pants. Although Rohan said nothing, Archana felt that he was not happy with what he was seeing. "Madam, aren't there any dresses like the ones you buy for yourself?" "Oh, but wouldn't that be a little awkward for your wife, Rohan?" "Don't worry, madam. I will take care of it. I want her to look as amazing as you do." Archana smiled. The compliment might have seemed a little perverse, but she knew him well enough to understand what he meant. She again gave instructions to the saleswoman, and now Rohan was surprised at what appeared before him. Backless, low-cut, sleeveless, and so on. They chose a couple of outfits, and Archana insisted on paying for at least one of them as a gift. Rohan had to give up, and they went back home. "Thank you, madam. I'm sure she'll love it." "Oh, no thanks, Rohan. I love shopping, and you know it." "Madam, will you keep this at home for now? I don't want her to find it before the case." "Oh, no problem," Archana said as she pulled up to her house. He dropped her off and left. Archana felt ecstatic, but couldn't understand why. The rest of the day passed as usual, and Mohit returned later in the evening. Archana used to wait for him to freshen up before serving dinner. They soon finished dinner and were scrolling through their phones on the bed. "So, how was shopping?" asked Mohit. "Everything was fine. Rohan chose 2 dresses, and both of them are daring to say the least," Archana replied, and stood up to show Mohit the dresses. "Wow, he chose these for his wife. Where does he expect her to wear them?" "That's my question. But he said he liked the way she looked in similar dresses, and he wanted his wife to look the same." Mohit put the dresses aside and looked at his wife. "So he liked the way my wife looked in those revealing dresses. Did he say that?" And pulled her to the bed, gently cupping her breasts. Archana was a bit cheerful. Mohit rarely initiated sex in this way, and he had not missed 2 nights in a row for a long time. Still, something excited him greatly, and he soon found himself on top of her naked body, out of breath. The sex lasted barely a minute again, but today Archana had to ask. "What's going on? You seem full of energy lately," she asked as he rolled onto his back, calming down. I don't know, the thought of someone complimenting you in these revealing dresses. It's hard to explain," he said. "So the thought of other men and your wife turns you on?" Archana asked, trying to tease. She had read some erotic literature and knew about the phenomenon where men get aroused by the thought of their partner being with someone else. She thought it was very erotic, but she never believed that this was happening in the real world. And yet here she was, discussing something very similar with her husband. He soon fell asleep without a definite answer to her question, but this new revelation haunted Archana for a long time. As long as she knew how to get her husband to be in the mood when she wanted him to be. Days passed, and the couple began to talk more and more often about the presence of this third man. Mohit was both extremely excited and surprised at how his wife not only didn't object to it, but also initiated the same. He asked about school hobbies, her friends' husbands, colleagues, casual acquaintances, and much more. Archana understood where they were going, but to her, they were simply trying to bring excitement back into their bed life. But as they pushed the boundaries further, it became clear that this would not end there. Everything changed for Archana herself. She satisfied herself almost every day, and she began to freely fantasize about other men without feeling guilty. There was one man who made her pleasure harder and faster than anyone else, Rohan. Perhaps it was because it all started with her meeting him, or because he seemed alpha in his demeanor. She started leaking within minutes of thinking about him. Mohit was also aware of this, as she answered his name without hesitation when he asked who she thinks about most when she pleases herself. This was a bit of a surprise to him because he thought it would be some rich hottie or ex-boyfriend. Things wouldn't stay the same, and they knew it. Mohit was in his office, reclining in a comfortable chair with a bunch of files on the table in front of him. He had to work, but his thoughts were scattered. Although he was in his 30s, the past few weeks had reminded him of what it was like to be a teenager again. He felt aroused in places he shouldn't have, thought about sex in places he shouldn't have. The reason was his newfound obsession with imagining his wife with a man he could see from the window, scrolling through her phone in the driver's seat of his car. Both Mohit and Archana expected that this would bring them a temporary rush of emotions and help bring back passion into their bed life. It did help them break down the walls of their routine sex life, but they also found themselves going deeper. Even on the days when Mohit was too tired to have sex, he still wanted to listen to Archana telling him about her self-pleasure sessions, about her encounters with other men in malls while shopping, about the lewd looks she received from the young men on the streets, and most importantly, about Rohan. Although Mohit was incredibly excited by these conversations, Archana was a little worried that he was taking them to a point that could change the nature of their marriage forever. She knew it couldn't be all fun and games for long, and sooner or later, they would either have to put an end to it, or they would be on the brink of no return. A few more days passed, and although the physical relationship didn't work out, Mohit began using the internet to learn more about his desires. He learned about the idea of divorcing wives and the practice of cuckolding. He was happy to see that there were many people who shared his desires, and that he wasn't strange. He spent his time reading stories online and imagining his wife in all these scenarios. In his mind, he was ready to take another step forward. "Are you crazy?" Archana said, out of breath, panting and trying to control her voice after the intense sex. "I know it sounds extreme, but I think I'm ready for this," Mohit said, settling down next to his wife on the bed. Archana was silent for several moments, still recovering from the surge of emotions. Lately, Mohit has started paying a lot more attention to her wishes, and she couldn't be happier. This new level of intimacy between them brought her real satisfaction, and she treasured every moment of it. "I don't know. This seems so risky and extreme," she said, looking up at the ceiling. She couldn't help but imagine Rohan instead of Mohit next to her in bed, even expressing her reluctance to the idea. It wasn't Rohan's presence, but Mohit's absence that made her feel uncomfortable. She wanted to discuss it further, but Mohit's snoring soon killed all hope. A million thoughts pierced her head. Her husband has just admitted that the thought of her dating other men turns him on. She tossed and turned all night, but it was very late when she was finally able to close her eyes. When she woke up the next morning, Mohit was already getting ready. She looked at the clock, which read 9:12. She jumped out of bed when Mohit entered the room, ready to leave. "Oh, good morning, dear," he said with a smile when he saw Archana. "I'm very sorry, I didn't sleep well," she answered in a sleepy voice. "Oh, don't worry about it. I will send Rohan later to pick up my lunch," Mohit said and kissed her cheeks, waving goodbye. The mention of Rohan's name brought all those thoughts back into her mind. She stretched a little, threw on her robe, and began her morning routine. For some strange reason, the storm of thoughts of the previous night was much more pleasant when combined with the anticipation of Rohan's arrival. She quickly finished her chores and took a long shower, which was always her favorite place to think. She was wearing a long robe and holding a cup of tea when she heard the doorbell ring. She opened the door and saw what she expected Rohan. "Good morning, madam. Sir sent me to pick up his lunch," Rohan said with a polite smile. It was very difficult for him to understand him due to his constant polite expression. "Oh, come in, Rohan. Are you in a hurry?" Archana asked, stepping aside to let him in. A smile appeared on her face as she couldn't help but look at him from a different angle. It's one thing to imagine someone on top of you, touching you, and quite another to see them in front of you in real life. "No, madam, I just need to be back for dinner," he said, coming in and sitting down on the sofa. At first, he was not very comfortable in the house of his employers, but both Mohit and Archana gradually asked so insistently that he overcame his inhibitions. "Great, then we can have tea. I missed your tea this morning and felt very guilty," she said with a giggle, handing him the cup. "Why guilty, madam? We are all just people," Rohan replied, accepting the cup from her hands. Archana took a seat opposite him and crossed her legs. The robe was long enough to cover her properly, but sitting cross-legged, one of her legs, which she had shaved that day, was visible. Mohit glanced at Archana's feet as she sipped her tea. "So, did your wife like this dress? You never told me," Archana said after several minutes of silence. "Oh yes, sorry madam, I never thanked you for your help that day." She was a little surprised as she had only seen such dresses in films and TV before, but when she tried it, she really liked it, Rohan said with a smile that showed that he enjoyed imagining these moments. "That's great, I'm glad I could help," Archana said, taking a sip of tea. Mohit's eyes kept flicking to Archana's feet. At first, Archana wasn't paying attention, but once she saw Rohan trying to steal glances without making it too obvious, she realized that her legs were on display. She immediately felt a tingling sensation between her legs, her breathing gradually becoming heavier. Rohan also realized that he was caught looking at her legs, but he was surprised that Archana did not try to hide it or change her position. Rohan always respected Archana because she was always so kind to him, but he could not deny the fact that she is a very attractive woman and would be desired by any man, including himself. Rohan felt a sudden tension wash over him. His wife did pay attention to her appearance, but she did not have the same magnetic attraction that came from the woman in front of him. He had often caught himself thinking about Archana, but had never before thought about crossing the line of what was permitted. "I have to go," he said, standing up. "I hope you enjoyed it," Archana said with a grin on her face. "What?" Rohan asked in a slightly surprised voice. "Tea. I hope you enjoyed the tea," Archana replied, smiling wider, and, taking him by surprise, she handed him Mohit's lunch bag. "Oh, ha ha. Yes, he was great as always, madam," Rohan said with relief, took the bag, and quickly left. When Archana closed the door, she immediately ran to the bedroom. Taking off her robe, she walked to the bed and froze for a moment, her thoughts drowned in a whirlwind of sensations. There was a subtle aroma in the air, causing a pleasant excitement. She closed her eyes, allowing her imagination to transport her to another world, a world where everything happened the way she wanted. Her breathing deepened, and her fingers involuntarily clenched. The image of Rohan appeared in her mind, his gaze, his touch, his closeness. She seemed to hear his voice and feel the warmth of his hands. At that moment, she was filled with confidence and freedom. As her mind returned to reality, a slight grin appeared on her face. She looked at the ceiling fan, and not the slightest hint of doubt or shame remained in her thoughts. The decision was made. Her heart and mind were in harmony. The silence of the room was broken only by barely audible sounds and intermittent breathing. Vimla and Rohan were absorbed in the moment of intimacy, which seemed to isolate them from the rest of the world. She stood on all fours, feeling his touch on her, and he, closing his eyes, was completely immersed in his thoughts and sensations. Her figure, short and feminine, emphasized her natural attractiveness. Some time later, Rohan froze, as if trying to prolong the last moment of their togetherness. He sighed heavily and sank onto the bed next to her, allowing rest to completely take over him. The room was filled with silence again, broken only by the measured breathing of two people who for a moment disappeared into each other. Vimla went to clean herself up and joined him in bed again. For Vimla, sex was something she did only for her husband. She had no expectations and asked no questions when her husband started. Rohan found this a bit annoying as he had a very strong libido. He was proud of his masculinity and knew that his stamina was better than most Indian men. Although his wife had no complaints about him, he was really upset about the lack of interest she showed in his efforts. He experimented with movements, positions, and recently even bought her a beautiful dress. But for Vimla, sex remained a routine. However, even Vimla could tell that something was different today. Rohan's passion was on point in the way he started and finished sex. She didn't know what prompted him that morning, but she wasn't curious either. Soon they both fell asleep as he had to get up early for work the next day. Although Rohan was just a driver, their financial situation was good and Vimla did not have to work to support them like other people around, which suited her just fine. Archana opened her eyes and saw that the clock showed 6:30. She slowly stood up and stretched. To her right, Mohit was still sleeping. A smile lit up her face as she began to remember what happened last night. Mohit came twice that night, satisfying himself by hearing Archana describe in detail what had happened. There was nothing sexual between Archana and Rohan, but she caught him looking and enjoying the sight of her naked legs. This was enough for Mohit, and he started asking question after question, trying to find out everything about his wife's thoughts, her reaction, and what was going through her mind when she was pleasuring herself. Mohit was now almost sure that she would be inclined to take it further, but she would be embarrassed to bring up the topic herself. So he made up the excuse of having to meet in another city over the weekend, which would require him to leave the next day. Archana did not suspect anything, but the sudden announcement made her look twice at him. This didn't bother her as she felt more comfortable exploring things alone. She didn't even know yet what she would do, or whether she would do anything at all. The bags were packed and Rohan arrived on time to take Mohit to the airport. While Rohan was loading the bags into the car, Mohit quickly returned inside and brought Archana to the bedroom, taking her away from Rohan's eyes for a few moments of kissing. "Do you think anything will happen if I'm not there?" Mohit asks as his hands start playing with Archana's breasts. "I don't know," Archana answers, letting out a sigh. "I'm always just a call away if you want to talk," he says and kisses her on the lips. Mohit boarded the flight and checked into one of his favorite resorts for the weekend. He wasn't even sure that something would happen between his wife and Rohan, but he knew that if he had not left, then nothing would have happened. He ordered drinks and began a relaxing weekend several hundred miles away from his wife, who now had the weekend and the house to herself. Rohan also felt a little elated and returned to Archana after taking Mohit to the airport. He rang the doorbell and Archana invited him inside again for tea. "Madam, if you don't mind, I can ask, aren't you bored of being alone?" Rohan asked, sipping his tea. "Well, there's a lot to do, but yes, sometimes I get a little bored when I'm just sitting and scrolling through my phone," Archana replied. "Oh, I always ask Vimla the same thing, but she's too adaptable. She never has any desire to go on vacation or anything like that," says Rohan. "Well, women always adapt to our culture. I guess we can't blame her," Archana replies. "Yes, madam, you are right. That's why I always ask her if she wants to go somewhere, even just for a day or two. But she always refuses. What are you going to do?" "I think you also have some free time until Mohit returns." "Well, if you don't have plans, lady, I was thinking of going to the village. I don't have any relatives there anymore, but I have a piece of land and I like to go there sometimes." "Oh, I didn't know," Archana said, feigning joy. She was disappointed that Rohan would also leave, leaving her alone. "Yes, did you have any plans, madam?" he asked again. Archana tried to quickly come up with something, but couldn't, and to avoid awkwardness, she said, "No, you can go, Rohan." "Oh, thank you very much, madam. I think I'll go tomorrow," he said with a smile. Archana simply smiled back, cursing herself for not being able to think of something in time. But on the other hand, she never liked to initiate anything. There were a few moments of silence as Rohan finished his tea. "Mistress, if you have no plans, perhaps I can take you with me," Rohan said in a suggestive tone. "Me?" Archana asked in surprise. "Yes, madam, I always ask Vimla, but she has already seen this place so many times that she is no longer interested, and I think you'll like the change of scenery." Archana's breathing became heavier as she pondered. The thought of being alone with Rohan for an extended period of time was too risky to pass up. "Oh, of course, I haven't left this city for a long time," she said after pretending to think, trying not to show her excitement. "Great, it's only a 30-minute drive from here. What time should I pick you up, madam?" he asked with a smile. "I think we can leave by 9 and be back by lunch," Archana said. "Oh, lady, but the morning traffic jams on this highway are terrible. I think it's better for us to leave after lunch, and then we'll be back before sunset," he suggested. "Oh, yes, no problem," she replied. Rohan stood up with a smile, handing the cup to Archana. "Okay, madam, then I'll see you tomorrow," and he left. He couldn't believe his luck at how easily he convinced Archana to accompany him alone. She seemed almost glad to join him. How quickly she agreed. He shrugged because there was no reason for him to complain. Archana called Mohit later in the night to tell him about the plans for the next day, while he was drinking beer in his room. The news immediately excited him, and he began asking questions. Archana brushed off all his questions and said that she would discuss everything in more detail when something actually happened. Archana went to bed, and Mohit introduced his wife. The next morning, Rohan called Archana to confirm the plan, and she confirmed. Lunchtime dragged on like an eternity for Archana, who spent most of the time choosing what to wear. She finally settled on a light green saree with a darker shade of blouse. She took a long shower, put on some makeup, and was ready with plenty of time to spare. Rohan rang the doorbell around 3 p.m. and Archana answered. He looked at her briefly and then smiled. "Madam, you dressed well for such a short and relaxed trip." "Haha, I haven't worn a sari for a long time, so I decided to try it," answered Archana. She asked if Rohan wanted water or tea, to which he politely declined. Soon they were on the highway. Archana was sitting at an angle opposite Rohan in the back seat with a slight smile on her face. They chatted about families, the weather, and other trivial things on the road. Archana noticed that Rohan was also dressed better than usual. His strong physique hugged his shirt impressively, making Archana subconsciously compare his figure to that of her own husband. The window was slightly open, and she began to look out the window as buildings gave way to trees and cars to cattle. They pulled off the highway, and after a few minutes of driving on a dirt road, Rohan pulled the car to the side. "We'll have to walk a little, lady." "Don't worry, it's not far," he said, getting out of the car. "Okay," Archana replied and got out of the car, looking around. Several huts in the distance and the farmland surrounding them. She looked up into the sky and saw looming clouds that made the sunlight more tolerable. Archana found it a little difficult to walk in high sandals on the uneven ground. She didn't think they'd have to walk. Rohan told her about the land and the surrounding village as he led her. She constantly expressed concern, carefully placing each step so as not to twist her ankle. "Here it is, lady," he said proudly, finally stopping in front of a fairly large plot of land. Archana finally eased her breathing and looked at the impressive size of the land. "Wow, not bad, Rohan. Did you buy it yourself?" she asked. "I inherited half from my father and bought the other half from my cousin," he answered. "You should be proud of this," she said, seeing how flattered he was looking at his land. "Ha ha, you are too kind, madam. This is the rice I planted and is expected to be harvested next month," he said, pointing to the crops. "Yes, I know. My father took me here to harvest when I was a child," she said, walking closer and running her hands over the crops as they heard the clouds rumble. "Oh, so you know about farms. I thought you were an urbanist since childhood," he said in a joking manner with a smile. "Ha ha, well, I think I've been physically standing here for over 10 years. So thank you for that," Archana said as light rain began to fall from the sky. I think it's time for us to head back." "Looks like the rain will get heavier," Rohan said, looking up. "Oh, already," Archana said with a disappointed voice. She enjoyed the conversation and the light breeze, knowing that as soon as they returned, she would be alone again. But she didn't want to catch a cold either. "Well, we can wait under the shade of that tree. If the rain stops soon, we can spend more time together," Rohan said, convinced that Archana wanted to spend more time and that she didn't care that much about the field. Archana nodded with a smile, and they began to walk towards the tree that was at the opposite end of the square area. Archana became even more careful as the ground gradually became dirty and slippery. The rain got heavier while they were in the shade, partially getting wet. "Oh no, this might be a bad idea if the rain stays for long," Archana says, wiping her face. "Oh, we'd be soaking wet if we tried to get back to the car," Rohan replies, catching his breath a little after a light jog. The place where they stood was slightly inclined, making it difficult for Archana to maintain her balance. She tries to lean on the tree, but the trunk is too thick to grab onto. Rohan sees her lose her balance, waits a moment, and then holds out his hand. She willingly takes it, looking at him with a smile as if expressing gratitude. Rohan felt an inner rush as her touch made his heart beat faster. He tried to remain calm, but he understood that Archana's proximity awakened emotions in him that were difficult to control. He noticed how her sari was stuck to her skin from the rain and her wet hair was stuck to her cheeks. He wanted to look at her, but he was afraid that he would not be able to hide his feelings. Archana also felt the tension hanging between them. Despite her inner doubts, part of her soul longed to get closer to Rohan, to feel his presence even more acutely. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her rapid breathing, but the silence and the soft sound of the rain only intensified the atmosphere. The rain did not stop, and with every minute the darkness thickened around them. Under the cover of raindrops and soft darkness, they stood silently side by side, each of them immersed in their own thoughts and emotions that were difficult to express in words. "Ma'am, I think we should head back. Being stuck here in the dark will be a bigger problem than getting wet," he says, looking at her. He sees how her breasts are stuck to the saria. The saria becomes transparent with moisture. His body reacts immediately, he just can't help it. Archana looks at him and nods in agreement. She knows she can't run and will get completely wet on the way back, but there is no other choice. Rohan goes with her too, supporting her as they head to the car, covered in water. "Oh my God, I'm glad we came back without falling," she says, wiping some water from her hair and face, laughing. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I shouldn't have asked you to come with me. Now, if you get sick, I will feel very bad," Rohan says quickly, starting to start the car and drive. "Don't be stupid. You couldn't have known it would rain so hard," she replies, leaning back in her seat. Saria was completely stuck to her skin. There was almost no conversation on the way home. Rohan was focused on getting there as quickly as possible. When they arrive home, Rohan accompanies her to the door. "Okay, ma'am, I think it's time for me to head back. Sorry again." "Are you crazy? Dry yourself, come inside," she says sternly and goes inside without waiting for an answer. Rohan follows her inside, closing the door behind him. The thought of being alone with Archana makes him horny again. Archana goes to the bedroom and comes back with 2 towels. "Here, I'm going to give you your sir's clothes, and then you can leave," she says with a smile. "No, no, ma'am. I can't wear sir's clothes. Please don't force me," he replies, folding his hands to show that it's simply not possible. "Well, the alternative is to wait for your clothes to dry," she says with a challenge in her eyes. Rohan remains silent and continues drying his hair. He finds it difficult to take his eyes off Archana with every passing moment. "Okay, ma'am, I can wait," he says, returning her smile. At the risk of being too blunt, he looks at Archana curiously to see what she has to say. Archana is actually a little surprised. Her heart is beating fast. "Okay, then you will find a robe in that closet. You can wear it until your clothes are dry." Rohan heads to the closet, then to the bathroom to change into a robe, even abandoning his underwear. He places it next to the heater to dry. Just as he comes out of the bathroom, the electricity goes off, and he hears Archana's voice. "Oh shit, Rohan, I'm in the bedroom. Can you please take a candle from the top drawer of the same cupboard? The backup power is not working," she says. Rohan finds a candle and lights it. He heads towards the bedroom, not sure if he should go in, and knocks on the door. Come in," Archana says with a little hesitation. She was in the process of undressing when the power went out. Her sari was lying on the floor along with her blouse. Rohan's eyes widen as he sees Archana with a towel wrapped around her. She invited him in with a candle, knowing that he would see her in this state. Rohan thinks about turning away, but now his lust takes over his feelings. He looks straight into Archana's eyes and continues to look at her without saying a word. Archana knows the consequences for her too. If there was ever a moment when she wanted to be with another man, it was him. Rohan comes closer and waits to see if she will resist. Both continue to look into each other's eyes. Rohan places the candle on the table next to them, then places his hands on Archana's waist. He hears her breathing heavily. When he realizes she's not resisting, He moves her damp hair away from her face and begins to kiss her deeply. Archana closes his eyes. There is nowhere to retreat. He feels his dense lips on his. He is not as good a kisser as her husband, but the unbridled passion immediately weakens Archana to her knees. She is in a trance, and by the time they break the kiss, Rohan is already on top of her on the bed. This isn't right, Rohan says, catching his breath as they break the kiss. Should we stop? Archana asks as she continues to unbutton Rohan's robe. His hands reach for the towel stuck to her body, and he slides it off in one smooth motion. They continue to undress each other through kisses without saying a word. Rohan slowed down, his gaze lingering on Arhan, taking in every detail of her expression. Their closeness no longer left any doubt. An invisible connection had been established between them, which demanded continuation. His hand gently touched her thigh, and he felt her tremble. Tension hung in the air, and both of their breathing became deeper and more ragged. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice hoarse and full of doubt. Archana nodded, her gaze firm but soft at the same time. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders, pulling him closer. Rohan sank down to her, their faces almost touching, and their gazes intertwined. Everything was clear in this silent dialogue: trust, desire, and readiness. They moved in the same rhythm, gradually overcoming awkwardness and fear. It was as if everything else had disappeared, just the two of them, just this moment. Their breathing merged, and their touches became more and more confident. When it was all over, Rohan lingered next to her, their hearts still racing. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her face and smiled softly. At that moment there were no words, but they were not required. Everything had already been said. There was silence outside the window, and soft light filtered through the curtains, illuminating the two of them as if frozen in time. The sensations become too much for Archana, who experiences the most profound and emotional moment of intimacy in her life. Her breathing becomes labored and her body trembles. There is silence in the room, broken only by the sounds of their ragged breathing and muffled sighs. Archana feels a wave of emotions growing, filling her from the inside and making her forget about everything in the world. It was different, more exciting, more sensual, and surprisingly intimate. Rohan, without taking his eyes off her face, feels the same connection, something more than just physical attraction. Their movements slow down, giving way to tenderness and deep understanding. Time seems to freeze, leaving them alone at this moment. After some time, they find themselves next to each other, breathing heavily and not saying a word. The room is calm, and the air is filled with a feeling of closeness and trust. Archana lies staring at the ceiling, trying to comprehend everything that just happened. Rohan looks at her with a slight smile, touching her hand. They both know that this moment changed something inside them forever. "It was amazing," Rohan says, turning to Archana. She simply smiles back. She doesn't want to ruin the emotions and pleasure she feels with words. She knows that soon she will have to tell her husband about this in detail, but now she just feels tired and euphoric at the same time. She doesn't even want to get up to clean herself. She feels Rohan hug her, and they fall asleep. They have taken the first step, and now it remains to be seen how far they will go and how it will affect their lives. Mohit was sitting on a bar stool with an open bottle of JD. He looked at the floating ice cubes slowly melting into his temples, his mind clearly elsewhere. It was clear that a long time had passed since he had taken his first sip, and he had probably lost count of how many there had been. A week has passed since Archana confessed to him about the events that happened between her and Rohan. He couldn't say even after a week how he felt about it. It was he who encouraged her to go down this path, and it was he who was turned on by the thought of his wife being naughty with other men. But when she confessed, he noticed a smile on her face and satisfaction. She didn't feel guilty about it, as he always asked her. As he poured himself another drink, he tried to decide whether to ask if she wanted to do it again, if she had already done it again, if he even had the right to do this. A million questions flashed through his head when the bartender came up and asked for his calculation. It was time to close. Mohit sighed and took out his wallet, asking the bartender if he could help him find a room to spend the night. The alarm pierced the silence again, and Archana woke up. She looked at the other side of the bed, which was empty again. This had happened frequently in the past week, and her husband had offered no explanation as to where he spent his nights. She sighed and got out of bed. Walking into the kitchen to make tea, she picked up her phone to call him, only to receive an off message. Neither she nor Rohan expected it to be so easy, but neither of them had the courage to even look into each other's eyes, let alone talk about it. Although Archana believed that talking with her husband could calm her down a little, she knew that sometimes it is better not to mix fantasies and the real world. She felt like it took quite a long time for Mohit to accept the fact that she wasn't just talking to excite him, but was actually confessing to something that had happened in the real world. And although he showed no anger or remorse, she knew he couldn't sleep that night. All three of them tried to remain normal, hoping that eventually they would just forget about it and everything would go back to normal. Rohana woke up to the sound of dishes clinking in the kitchen, his eyes gradually adjusting to the light as he looked at the ceiling and wondered what time it was. Slowly getting up and leaning against the wall, he saw Vimla hurriedly doing her morning chores, which meant she had overslept again. He couldn't blame her for that, knowing that she must be tired after how he had tormented her last night. Rohana was having a hard time digesting his night with Archana, and not being able to discuss it only added to his confusion. Luckily for him, he had a wife who never asked questions when he wanted her in bed. She simply considered it part of her feminine duties and obeyed when and how he demanded. But even Vimla could feel that the past week had been different. Her husband's sexual desire seemed to have skyrocketed. He usually goes through phases where he is particularly needy, but this usually only lasted a couple of days. But this time it was different. She missed her daytime dreams because when Rohan was at home, he wanted to wear her out like an animal, almost as if he was looking for something that wasn't there. "Come here," Rohit said, looking at Vimla, who was struggling to complete her morning chores. "Not now," she said, quickly glancing over to see his morning excitement. "I'll be late like yesterday, and that will mean listening to Madam's tantrums all day," she said and wiped her hands. Rohan simply nodded in understanding. Usually, he didn't pay attention to her explanations, but he couldn't find satisfaction after that night. It was like eating a forbidden fruit, and now that he had tasted it, nothing else could satisfy his appetite. He knew for sure that he could satisfy her, and now he had no other options. He decided to be brave. Archana was busy with kitchen chores when she saw Mohit enter through the front gate. She quickly walked up to him and realized with one glance that he was suffering from a hangover. She was angry, she was worried, but she didn't say anything. They exchanged glances and he went to the shower. Archana knew that this would not stop him from going to the office and returned to the kitchen to pack his lunch. Rohan arrived on time as always and rang the doorbell to announce his arrival. Archana walked towards the front gate, her heart beating faster. "Sahab is in the shower. This will take some time. Wait," she said without expression on her face. Rohan nodded, but looked at her intently. They both exchanged nervous glances, but he was determined to either find closure or find a way forward. Mohit soon came downstairs and Rohan greeted him with a smile, Rohan clearly unaware that his actions were fully known to his employer. Of course, this was never Mohit's intention or interest. "I may have to stay in the office late today as we have a financial audit coming up soon," Mohit said. Both Archana and Rohan heard this. Archana was slightly worried about Mohit's condition, but she did not question him. Rohan and Mohit got into the car and drove away, leaving Archana with the feeling of confusion that she felt every time she was in the company of both men. "Oh, Rohan, do me a favor. I think I forgot my lunch." "Take it after you let me go," Mohit said expressionlessly. "Jai Sahab," said Rohan, with excitement building within him. Rohan dropped Mohit at the office and immediately hurried back. He felt like a teenager who finally had a chance to be alone with a girl. He hadn't felt this way for a long time. He slipped past the traffic and spent half the time it normally took him to travel. Taking a deep breath, he gets out of the car. He collected his thoughts and confidently walked to the door, ringing the bell. Archana opened the door and was shocked for a moment. "Rohan, "Are you there?" she asked in a puzzled voice, peeking to see if Mohit was in the car. "Sahab forgot his lunch and asked me to collect it after I dropped him off," he said with a smile. "Oh, okay, wait, I'll get it," Archana said, swallowing her saliva, and walked back to the kitchen. Just as she got her lunch out of the kitchen, she heard the door slam shut. Rohan was now in the house and standing in the hallway. He looked at her with a blank expression. He made his decision, but had no idea what kind of reaction he would receive. The erection in his pants was now obvious, and he had no intention of hiding it. His posture made it hard to miss in his tight pants. Archana saw him, and her eyes went down to his groin. She felt her breathing getting heavier every second as she had replayed this moment in her mind more than once. "I want it again," Rohan said in a calm voice, looking straight into her eyes. "You're crazy," Archana said, not even pretending that she didn't understand what he was talking about. "Madam, I want it again," he repeated and took a step forward. Archana took a few steps back and shook her head, making it clear that she did not want this at all. "I know you enjoyed that night as much as I did," he said as he continued to move closer to her. "It was a mistake, Rohan. We are both married," she said, trying to convince him and herself. Archana stood in the hallway, holding a container of lunch for Mohit. Rohan took a step forward, his eyes meeting hers. There was silence in the room, broken only by their heavy breathing. "Rohan, it's time for you to leave," she said quietly, but there was no firmness in her voice. "Madam." His voice trembled, but there was determination in it. "I can't get that night out of my head." Archana looked away. Her heart was beating wildly. She felt the heat spreading throughout her body. The words got stuck in my throat. "It was a mistake, Rohan," she finally breathed. "No, not a mistake. We both wanted it, madam. And," he took a step closer, "I know you're thinking about it too." She took a step back and ran into the wall. Rohan stopped. He didn't want to scare her, but his desire, his desperation, was impossible to hide. "You don't understand." Her voice broke. "It will destroy everything. My life, your life, our families." Rohan was silent. He understood this perfectly, but there was such pain in his eyes that Archana could not look at him. He turned away and ran his hand over his face. "Why didn't you stop me then?" he asked without turning around. "Because she trailed off. "Because I wanted it," she whispered. These words hung in the air. Rohan turned around, his eyes widening. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. They both stood there, unable to move. "But this cannot happen again," Archana said in a more confident voice. "You must forget about this." "Can you do it?" he asked. She didn't answer. Her eyes filled with tears, and she turned away. "Go away, Rohan," she said in a hoarse voice. Rohan froze, then nodded and headed towards the exit. When the door closed behind him, Archana slowly slid down the wall and covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook with quiet sobs. Outside, Rohan got into the car and gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He closed his eyes and took several deep breaths. An inner voice told him that this was the end, but his heart said something completely different. The silence in the house was deafening. Archana sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling and her heart still pounding in her chest. She looked at her palms as if an explanation for her actions was written there. Time stood still, and the only sound was the tick-tock of the wall clock. The phone vibrated. Message from Mohit. "Hi, honey. My flight is early. I'll be home in the evening. Love you." Her heart sank. A lump appeared in my throat. She wasn't ready for him to return so soon. Memories of Mohit making passionate love to her after finding out about her conversations with Rohan surfaced in her mind. But now reality came between them, a reality that could not be ignored. The door opened and Mohit entered the house. Tired, but with a slight smile on his face. Archana stood by the stairs, her face expressing a mixture of relief and concern. She walked up to him and hugged him. "You're early," she whispered. "Yes, we managed to finish things faster. Did you miss me?" he asked, kissing her forehead. Yes, of course, she answered, hiding her gaze. Mohit noticed her trembling hands, but said nothing. He put down his bag and headed to the shower. Archana, like an automaton, set the table. Rohan's voice rang in her head, his touch still burning on her skin. Mohit was strangely silent at dinner. He looked at his wife as if he was trying to solve a riddle. Finally, he put down his fork and said, "How was your weekend?" Archana froze, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. She looked up and met his gaze. "An ordinary weekend. I rested a little, walked around the house." Her voice was even, but her eyes darted. "Was Rohan here?" he asked calmly, but his eyes glared at her. Archana blinked. Did he know something? Or is this just an innocent question? She collected herself and answered, "Yes, he took your lunch." As usual. Mohit nodded, but something in his expression made her shudder internally. He didn't ask any more questions, but the silence that hung between them was unbearable. Archana was lying in bed, her eyes were open, and her gaze was fixed on the ceiling. Mohit lay next to her, his breathing was even, but she knew that he was not sleeping. She turned over to him and whispered, "Is something wrong?" Mohit opened his eyes and looked at her. There was so much pain and doubt in his gaze that Archana could not stand it. "Why are you acting so strange?" she asked. "I just..." He sighed. "I have a feeling that something has changed. Between us, in you." Archana froze. The words got stuck in her throat. "Maybe I'm just tired," he continued, looking away. "Forget." But both knew it was a lie. Rohan came as usual to take Mohit to work. When Archana opened the door, she felt her heart clench. She couldn't look him in the eye. "Good morning, madam," Rohan said quietly. "Good morning," she replied, quickly looking away. Mohit left the house with a bag in his hands. He stopped for a moment and looked at them both. Archana felt her knees buckle under the weight of his gaze. "Forget to pick me up in the evening." "I'll take a taxi," Mohit told Rohan and got into the car. When the car drove out of the gate, Rohan and Archana were left standing in silence. Their eyes met, and there was too much unspoken in them. I need to take care of business," Archana muttered and quickly went inside. Rohan grabbed the steering wheel and drove away. But he knew something had to change. They couldn't go on like this any longer. Silence was her constant companion. Archana sat in the living room, clutching a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Soft light came through the window, drawing shadows on the walls. She looked out into the street, where people were passing by, unaware that a real storm was brewing inside this house. Thoughts gave her no rest. The image of Rohan, his eyes, his touch, all this came up again and again. But at the same time, Mohit's face appeared before her, his fatigue, his doubts, his love. What am I doing? Why can't I just forget about it? She remembered the night with Rohan. She remembered how her body trembled, how her heart was ready to jump out of her chest. But now, sitting here, she felt only heaviness, not in the body, but in the soul. Archana stood up and walked towards the mirror. She looked at her reflection. The woman in the mirror was beautiful, well-groomed, but there was pain in her eyes. She ran her finger over the reflection, as if trying to touch the version of herself that had not yet made a mistake. But this is not a mistake. It was a desire. It was real. I wanted this. Why can't I accept this? She knew that her marriage with Mohit was based on trust. Trust, which was now like a fragile glass ball in her hands. One wrong step and everything will fall to pieces. Part 3. Archana's inner choice. Silence was her constant companion. Archana sat in the living room, clutching a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Soft light came through the window, drawing shadows on the walls. She looked out into the street, where people were passing by, unaware that a real storm was brewing inside this house. Thoughts gave her no rest. The image of Rohan, his eyes, his touch, all this came up again and again. But at the same time, Mohit's face appeared before her, his fatigue, his doubts, his love. What am I doing? Why can't I just forget about it? She remembered the night with Rohan. She remembered how her body trembled, how her heart was ready to jump out of her chest. But now, sitting here, she felt only heaviness. Not in the body, but in the soul. Archana stood up and walked towards the mirror. She looked at her reflection. The woman in the mirror was beautiful, well-groomed, but there was pain in her eyes. She ran her finger over the reflection, as if trying to touch the version of herself that had not yet made a mistake. But this is not a mistake. It was a desire. It was real. I wanted this. Why can't I accept this? She knew that her marriage with Mohit was based on trust. Trust, which was now like a fragile glass ball in her hands. One wrong step and everything will fall to pieces. Later that day, the sound of the doorbell made her jump. She walked over and opened the door. Rohan stood in front of her. His eyes showed concern, but he tried to look calm. "Madam, He began, but Archana raised her hand to stop him. "Why did you come?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even. "I can't get it out of my head." His voice trembled. "And I think you do too." Archana closed her eyes and took a deep breath. At that moment, she realized that she had to make a choice. Not for Rohan, not for Mohit, but for himself. "Rohan," she opened her eyes and looked at him. This must end. He froze. His gaze became empty, as if something had broken in him. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Because I can't lose myself. I can't lose what I have with Mohit. It doesn't mean I didn't want you, or that I didn't think about it. But this is wrong. For all of us." Rohan lowered his head. His shoulders slumped as if a heavy weight had fallen on him. "I understand, madam," he said finally. "Forgive me." "You don't have to apologize, Rohan." Her voice trembled. "We both made a choice. Now we have to live with its consequences." Rohan nodded and slowly turned towards the car. He didn't look back. The door closed and Archana leaned against it, closing her eyes. She felt tears running down her cheeks, but inside she felt something like relief. Mohit entered the house, which seemed cold and empty. He looked at his wife, who was standing at the window. Her gaze was directed somewhere into the distance. "How was your day?" he asked. "It's normal," Archana answered without turning around. "Archana," Mohit came closer and put his hand on her shoulder. "What's happening? You're not your usual self." She turned around and their eyes met. In her eyes, he saw pain and fatigue. "Mohit," her voice trembled. "Do you trust me?" He frowned but nodded. "Certainly." "Then please don't ask me questions you don't want to know the answer to," she whispered. Mohit froze. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but something in her voice made him remain silent. He nodded and hugged her, pulling her towards him. Archana closed her eyes and buried herself in his shoulder. At this moment, they both felt an emptiness that couldn't be filled, but they were together, and perhaps this was the only thing left for them now. A week has passed. A semblance of calm reigned in the house. Archana carried out her daily duties with her usual grace. Mohit left for work, and Rohan came driving every morning to take him to the office. Everything looked the same, but this was only a superficial illusion. Beneath this smooth shell hid a tense, viscous silence. She stood at the window, watching the car with Rohan and Mohit drive out of the gate. Her heart sank for a moment. She could no longer look Rohan in the eyes. They hardly exchanged glances. Their conversations were reduced to short remarks necessary for decency. Every morning began the same way. A smile for her husband, a slight nod for Rohan. The door closed and her hands began to tremble. She tried to convince herself that she had made the right choice. But why then does every glance from Rohan hurt her? She tried to distract herself. She embroidered, read books, went shopping, but her thoughts returned again and again to that day, to his look, to his voice, to the way he said her name. How much longer can I hide this? Rohan was sitting in the car in the parking lot. His hands were gripping the steering wheel, and his gaze was directed somewhere into the distance. His heart was heavy, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was left unfinished. Every time he saw Archana, his heart sank. He knew it was wrong, but he couldn't stop thinking about her. His sleep was restless, and even Vimla began to notice his detachment. "You have become something different, Rohan," she said one day at dinner. He just nodded and muttered something incomprehensible. How could he explain the fact that his mind was obsessed with another woman? Mohit sat in his office, looking at the photograph of his wife on the table. She was smiling in the photo taken many years ago. He ran his finger over her face and sighed. Why can't I get these thoughts out of my head? Why does every glance between Archana and Rohan seem too long to me? He trusted his wife. He loved her. But something has changed. She became thoughtful and distant. Sometimes he caught her just looking out the window, her thoughts somewhere far away. In the evening, when they went to bed, he wanted to hug her, but he felt a wall between them. She smiled, talked to him, but there was emptiness in her eyes. One day he asked, Arhana, are you happy with me? She smiled and stroked his cheek. Of course, Mohit. Why are you asking? But he saw her smile. She was too perfect, too forced. Three people found themselves locked in a web of their thoughts, fears, and secret desires. Each of them tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but every day it became more and more difficult. One afternoon, when Mohit was at work, Rohan came to the house again to pick up the documents that Mohit had forgotten. Archana opened the door. Their gazes met. Documents in the office. Wait a minute, I'll bring them, she said, going deeper into the house. When she returned, Rohan was standing in the living room. His gaze was fixed on her. Madam, he began, but Archana raised her hand. Please don't, Rohan. Just don't. I can't forget. I can't look at you and pretend that nothing happened. His voice trembled, but was full of sincerity. It doesn't matter anymore, she whispered. We can't change this. They stood opposite each other, and the air was so thick with tension that it was difficult to breathe. At that moment, the phone rang. It was Mohit. Hello, dear. I'll be late at work today. Have dinner without me. Okay, she replied, trying to remain calm. When she hung up, Rohan was already at the door. Go away, Rohan, please. He nodded and left without saying a word. But he was not ready to let her go, and she knew it. Archana sat in a dark room, wrapped in a blanket. She looked at the phone, at the message she couldn't send. I miss you. She removed it and closed her eyes. One evening, Mohit came home earlier than usual. The house was quiet. One lamp was burning in the living room, and there was an unfinished cup of tea on the table. He heard light footsteps on the second floor and walked up the stairs. The bedroom door was ajar. Inside, Archana sat on the bed, clutching her phone. She didn't notice him. Her eyes were full of tears. Mohit took a step forward, but something stopped him. He retreated and went downstairs. Later that night, he couldn't sleep. His mind was torn with guesses, doubts, and suspicions. At some point, he made a decision. The next day, when Rohan came to pick up Mohit, he said, Rohan, stay after work today. I have a conversation with you. Rohan froze, but nodded. All day, he could not find a place for himself. What does Mohit know? What is he going to say? Thoughts flashed like frames from an old film. In the evening, when Mohit was alone in the office, Rohan entered the office. Sit down, Mohit said, pointing to the chair opposite. They looked at each other for a few seconds. Mohit looked intently into Rohan's eyes, but Rohan could not bear his gaze. What happened between you and my wife? Mohit finally asked. Rohan froze. The words stuck in my throat. He opened his mouth, but closed it again. He began, but Mohit raised his hand. Only the truth, Rohan. Don't you dare lie. Silence hung in the room. Rohan closed his eyes and clenched his fists. It was a mistake, sir. This shouldn't have happened. But it happened, Mohit said quietly. Why? Rohan shook his head. I don't know, sir. It just happened. But I swear I love my wife, and I didn't mean to hurt you. Mohit looked at him silently. Then he got up and went to the window. Go away, Rohan. Tomorrow you won't work here anymore. Sir, Rohan began. Leave, Mohit said loudly, his voice trembling. Rohan stood up, lowered his head, and left the office. Mohit returned home late at night. Archana was waiting for him in the living room. She immediately realized that something had happened. Mohit. She began, but he raised his hand. I talked to Rohan, he said calmly. Tears filled her eyes. I didn't want this to happen. I tried to stop it. But it happened, he interrupted her. Archana nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Why, Archana? Didn't I love you? Didn't I care about you? Loved and cared, she whispered. But we have lost something important, Mohit. And I don't know when this happened. Mohit sat opposite her. They were silent for a long time. I fired him, he said finally. I couldn't see him every day. Forgive me, she whispered. I don't know if I can forgive you, Archana. His voice trembled. But I know one thing. I don't want to lose you. Archana closed her eyes, tears flowing endlessly. I don't want to lose you either, Mohit. Several months have passed. Rohan left the city with his wife. Nobody knew where they went. Archana and Mohit slowly tried to repair their marriage step by step. But something between them remained broken forever. A crack that won't go away no matter how hard they try. One evening, they were sitting on the veranda. Mohit held her hand while Archana looked at the sunset. We can handle it, right? She asked. We'll try, he replied. They looked at the horizon, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Somewhere far away, in a new place, Rohan looked out the window of a small house. His wife Vimla was cooking something in the kitchen. He closed his eyes and tried to let go of the past. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think. Click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to